Happy Thursday.
Thursday, how are you doing?
Oh, let's see. Just still don't ask that question. It's a very heavy, loaded question to ask. Give me another 2 weeks before I have to answer that.
Yeah, I feel like the appropriate question right now is like, how's the weather?
The
Yeah,
weather, beautiful.
it's nice.
In LA, it's beautiful. I can't really say all over the world, but we got the sun out. It's 72 degrees.
Lovely.
Yeah. How are you doing?
Hmm, I'm good.
Hmm.
Yeah, just having a day. I like nothing. I realized I had like asked somebody about whether or not we were gonna have a meeting, but I asked them last night and they're in New York. So I knew that when I got the answer, I was gonna have to like check my email at like 6 a.m. to see if we were having this like 8 a.m. meeting because it would be 11 a.m. Eastern. And it was just like a poor choice. It was all around because I was like, oh wow. Like I'm gonna, yeah, I just made it was an interesting move. I didn't realize it, and it was just too late to unsend the email because I was like, whatever. So anyways, I had to wake up to like make sure the meeting was on.
I think sometimes you forget you live in LA now.
Yeah. Yeah. Sometimes I'm like, and I also forgot that like other people don't check their email at like constantly all through the entire night.
Yeah. I had to really work hard to set boundaries for myself. But
Yeah.
actually, this might be the topic that we discuss because interesting enough, Adriel and I had to have conversations about like finding the middle path of our um relationship boundaries in a
Yeah.
sense last week. Which, interesting enough, he had listened to our podcast that we talked about how to have difficult conversations.
Mhm.
And I will say this was a very, very difficult conversation for both of us because there was like multiple conversations in one, like not knowing how to have this conversation with each other, not feeling connected with each other in the past couple of weeks for so
Mhm.
many other reasons, and also walking on eggshells around the boundaries of how we both are becoming kind of very into work and how much we're working and
Mhm.
how our what we're doing within our relationship is starting to shift and how to find that middle path, which was
Yeah.
it wasn't an easy, it was very difficult, honestly, in many ways. So I think that's actually a really good topic to go into today, how to have those
Yeah.
difficult conversations and find the middle path, how to walk that line.
Absolutely. So tell me about the conversation. Like what was the impetus for having this like difficult conversation? What was like the realization? How'd you get to it?
I will say it was Adriel actually had to bring it up because I'm like we've talked about, there's a lot happening in my personal life. So I'm dealing with so much family stuff and then also keeping up with work.
Yeah.
So like my literally even there are times that we're on the phone and I'm not listening to him. Like I'm literally not listening to him on the phone because my mind is somewhere else and I'm like texting work stuff or like texting the doctors for stuff. And like so he had to bring up this conversation of like and it was actually about the podcast because he was like, I want to give feedback around the podcast sometimes, but I don't know how to walk that line of giving you feedback without it becoming a reaction. And he actually took it back to the example of like when I used to give him feedback about acting and how he would have such an intense reaction to my feedback around acting. And then the conversation also had to go into like how much we're not focused on each other and how much we're paying attention to our careers and our jobs. Which it really, I will say, it took a lot of me And him, like, we had to pause multiple times in that conversation. It
What
was
was the hardest part for you?
also the hardest part was really understanding, like, not putting, like, but these are all the reasons why I am doing all these things. Like, I understand that you're mad, but I have reasons.
Yes.
Um, it's all these reasons that I'm doing all these things and all, and that was the hard to cut. The hardest part was to let go of all the, like, and I have justified reasons. Like, let's be honest, my mom's going through cancer, my dad's on life support, and I got like work stuff to do. So a lot
Yeah.
of justified reasons to
Mhm.
not have time. And at the same time, I had to keep mentally bringing myself back. And it's funny because we had the conversation and it was really still in my mind. What's the objective?
Mhm.
Objective of this? And the objective is we're trying to like make sure our relationship stays okay in the hardships of life. Like that's the objective. He's trying to make sure our relationship is okay. So listen to him. And that was the hard, I kept getting reactive. I kept getting defensive. I
Yeah.
kept cutting him off. Not
Mhm.
to lie, cut him off multiple times. I was like, yeah, but like,
Yeah, that's always super helpful. I like to
right?
throw a yeah, but in there. Yeah.
I think it's the most effective thing to do to just cut someone
Totally.
off and not let them finish and just say, I have a reason and I don't care what you have to say.
Yeah, that usually like I would say um really like gets the ball rolling on yeah, it's like really effective.
Totally helps the connection of the relationship too. Like totally makes you feel so much more connected to the person that's cutting you off. You feel so
Yes. Yeah.
heard.
Yeah, this is solid feedback, right? Like you're just yeah, like being cut off, interrupted. Makes me feel like really like heard.
You just totally want to keep continuing the conversation with the person. You don't want to stop. It's just so much fun to talk to someone that keeps cutting you off and also has excuses and reasons on why they're more right than you are.
Yeah, I love that too. Someone telling me why they're so much more right. I love their passion. No, it fucking sucks.
Yeah. Yeah, it was really hard, honestly. It really was. But I'm proud of him. He took that episode, which is so ironic because it started with wanting to give me feedback about the episode. And then at the end, I was like, you took that episode of listening, being willing, like kind of coming back and saying, yes, I understand, but you're cutting me off. Can we um and look, we found the middle path. And he's like, you do realize I worked harder than you.
Okay.
I was proud of him. But
Yeah.
it is, and it's kind of coming back to what we're talking about, having those conversations of even boundaries with our work,
Mhm.
within ourselves. Because it
I I also it's funny that talking about this because I'm also realizing I was reminded that I also got some feedback about the podcast from my husband. But this was like more corrective feedback.
Mhm.
I which, like, I get. Like, apparently, I had said that Charles set a limit around making me smoothies, and to be fair, Charles, you were correct, you do still make me smoothies sometimes, but you also said I had to learn.
Two
You
truths exist.
can make me a smoothie.
Oh.
Um, but I it's really funny because sometimes we'll be talking on the podcast, and I just kind of am like, "There are no repercussions to anything I say," and I just say whatever I want, and I wasn't, like, trying to lie or, like, trying to put him on the spot, but I'm like, I have to be careful because then I'm like, "It's really important that you listen to the podcast." And then he's like, "You're shit talking me on a podcast." And that's not cute. It's not that cute. I don't know what your feedback was. Mine was like, say accurate things and don't shit talk me on a podcast. which is totally appropriate.
It is actually very appropriate. And this is where we've had that conversation, Adriel and I, where and remember, we had an episode where I was like, well, my perception of what Adriel did was like, he was pretty much just saying, work out every single day. Where
Yeah, like
he's
putting the
like,
hammer down.
not even close, bro. Not even close to what I was actually. And I think that's actually funny because I tell him, I'm like, listen, sometimes my perception is going to be different. And
Yes.
I'm sharing my perception. Sometimes, and this I actually tell him a lot. I'm like, I like to be exaggerative because the exaggeration actually fits a lot of people's lives and it's very relatable. And also sometimes I just exaggerate because I have that personality. Like I'm like when someone asks me like, how much did you buy that? Sometimes I'll be like, I bought it for $20 when I actually spend like 40. And I like to exaggerate that I paid less because that's just one of I take pride in paying less on things. Or like with Adriel, I exaggerate because I'm like, he leaves his clothes everywhere all the time. Not really, not all the time, not everywhere. But I tell him, I'm like, feel free to comment
Yeah.
and write comments
Mhm.
on the post and that call me out and we can bring that up in the episode for ourselves because these are things other couples go through in other ways.
Of course. And I think it's probably not as, I think not everyone has to find out that their like partner like had a very different perception like on Spotify, but I think it's, and that's why I was like, I guess the stakes are a little bit higher. Like I would definitely want to crack that. Like if he overheard me talking to my sister on the phone, um being like, Charles never makes me a damn smoothie or whatever it was,
Yeah.
that's very different than being like, hey, I was listening to a podcast on Spotify and cool. You know, so I think it's like definitely the stakes. I think if that's something that I have to like just thinking about like a reference point of like it's a little bit different.
Yeah,
And it is hard to give somebody feedback as well. And I think he, doesn't want to be perceived a certain way, right? So he obviously is like, worried about that too.
of course.
So it's yeah, it definitely interesting. And it's interesting how for both of us, like in these conversations, it just like kind of ended up being such that it was like kind of oriented around the podcast of like getting this feedback. How did the two of you end up on the same page?
Well, I will say, and I think the best what happened was we really did once I noticed I was kind of like by the second time that he called me out that I was cutting him off, I was like, okay, let's stop, let's listen, let's
Yeah.
understand. It's not that we have to do everything exactly how he wants it. It's also not everything has to be done exactly how I want. And it's okay for certain things to shift and adjust. It doesn't have to be exactly how you want it to be. Um, you gotta be open to finding the
Yeah.
in between for both. And I think this is actually the perfect topic for you and I to figure out the balance on the podcast while we're doing it, because both our partners seem to be having, and I understand it, like being perceived in a certain way and certain things being talked about. So I think us within ourselves having that middle path, considering our partners and holding the boundary for ourselves,
Yeah.
um and kind of being like, okay, so what are the things that we want to allow or be okay with around our partners coming into the podcast? What are the things that we're kind of like, you know what, we are gonna have to learn to stop and not talk about those things on the podcast.
Yes. I feel like there are some difficult conversations headed our way because I think a lot of this is a lot of what we're starting to figure out is like where the boundaries are. And you oftentimes, this kind of goes back to even like our first episode of like sometimes you don't know what the boundary is until it's crossed. And
Yeah.
like what the boundary is here it like looks different. I've never been in a situation like this before where like somebody's going to hear something like kind of a recorded live session, right? Like that haven't been in this situation before, so I've never really known that we need to have boundaries around this. Like typically it's like I can say whatever I want to my sister because no one else is going to hear about it.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sure she just kind of blocks me out at a certain point because I just keep talking. So, but yeah, I think it's like having these conversations about like um what is and isn't okay.
Yeah. And I will say, even for myself, like it's interesting because up until now, even in our relationship, there are a lot of times where like he's a lot more private of a person than I am. I am a very, very, like, I'm very comfortable with just saying things as they are in my life. And I don't know why, but I'm just a very open person. I just have been.
Yeah.
Where he's not, and that's okay. That's actually, it's not a bad thing. We've talked about it a lot in our marriage, where it would be nice for me to learn how to have that balance, how to keep things private. Also, he's an actor. And as his career progresses, like it's definitely going to have to be a lot more private because I wouldn't want that kind of attention on my life personally. I've
Yeah.
even held that boundary with him. So to now have this kind of openness, I think it's me having to put in some work to being willing to notice when I feel, I think for me, the part of the middle path, this is such a difficult middle path to find because it really is changing my norm.
Yes. Yes. And I think we have to, and we only have to do this because like the middle path here, and for our listeners, like the middle path is really just finding that compromise oftentimes. And sometimes it's not really a compromise. Sometimes we just go in one direction or another, but we have to find a middle path because the context is different now.
Mhm.
Things
And
are
I want the middle path because I will say, like, no offense to you and I in our podcast, I love us, but my husband is more important than the podcast for me. Almost there, but
almost.
in a sense, well, honestly, like, yeah, I do agree with you. But if I'm gonna do that, like the podcast is very important to me because I really do love doing this every single week. It's just I love hanging out with you and it's fun for me. Um, but I don't want to like sacrifice. Like if it was a situation where I'm like, okay, the podcast is a little bit more important, so I'll find the middle path, but like there's only so much my compromise is my boundary of the compromise is I'm not compromising what I want the idea of this podcast to be, which again, I don't know what the idea of this podcast is. We're just going with the flow and figuring it out as we go. So the boundary does come to like the middle path boundary is I don't want my spouse to be to feel any discomfort around what other people perceive him as.
Yes.
So if that's the boundary, how do we practice mindfulness around what we say so they're not perceived in a different way?
I think the conversation that I need to have with Charles is like just figuring out what feels like out of bounds for him. And probably like I'm sure it seems like one of the big ones is like making sure I'm reporting accurately. And then also seeing if there are certain topics that just feel too private, to feel like that stuff, rather than just kind of doing this like wishful hoping thing where I just like talk and then I just hope
Mhm.
that he's not upset. Which is not really a good strategy.
So then I think the other thing, I like the plan of talking to Charles, and for me, I will talk to Adriel about it. So that's one plan to set up. I also think the other thing, because the other thing you and I do on this podcast is we don't prepare. We just start the
Yeah,
conversation. We press record and start.
yeah.
There's no preparation.
Yeah.
So we might have to prepare a little bit, which then in that case, I'm gonna ask the listeners to comment on what you want us to talk about. That'll help us prepare a little. If you're really enjoying this, just write what you want the topic to be and we'll talk about it. Whatever it is you want it to be. Um, but yeah, I think another step that we can take to meet that goal of respecting our spouse's boundaries is prepare a little bit.
Yes. And to know when we're going off book.
Mm-hmm.
Because yeah, I think we both have it the same tendency, which is like we'll just talk and then just see what happens, like let it out and not really have that, not having those guiding principles of like, this maybe isn't something this person wants me to share.
Yeah.
Like I feel like totally comfortable talking about like my GI issues on this podcast, but like maybe that's not the same for everybody.
Yeah. I think I like that. And that's where um having those limits and those boundaries for ourselves and starting to, and we can say it before we can do it like the TBT team meeting where you read the
Mhm.
TBT
Yeah.
rules. I don't want to say rules, but like,
It's
hmm,
our agreements.
our agreements. There you go. They are our agreements. We can write the agreements down, read it, prepare the topic, and kind of take it from there. Look at the middle path. We found the middle path.
And have conversations, they'll be more prepared with kind of when we're gonna, I think being intentional about using those examples and being better behaved. I get it. Okay.
I do too. I will say this was not easy to find the middle path. It took a lot of brain power from my head, man.
Oh yeah. I definitely I felt like I was like, I need to do something. And it took me a little bit. Sometimes it takes me a little while to figure out like where the truth will lie, what's gonna be the best outcome.
Yeah. If it
Well,
happened, Adriel and I did the same exact thing that day. This is kind of how we ended up finding the middle path, but it wasn't as fast and as quick because I wasn't as willing in the beginning.
yeah. Well, I knew in the moment, as soon as Charles confronted me, I was like, I am definitely in the wrong. I came to it very quickly because I was like, this is a clear example of me being wrong.
Yeah, see, I was a tad bit more emotional, which then I'm also a bit like when I'm that like I'm emotional and I'm overwhelmed with my emotions, I'm a lot more stubborn of like, I didn't do anything wrong. I have reasons on why I'm behaving the way I'm behaving. And then I was like,
You're like circling back on that.
yeah. All right. Well, we hope everyone enjoyed our podcast of finding the middle path of what it's going to look like moving forward and how we had some difficult conversation with our spouse, but also had a difficult conversation here.
Yes.
Solution finding. Well, happy Thursday, everybody.
Happy Thursday.
We'll see you. Hear you next week. Bye.